Do you ever remember that movie Unbreakable with Bruce Willis?
I know the movie. I did not like the movie, but yes, I remember it.
You don't like it?
It's okay.
Oh man, my whole opening's just tanked now.
Oh no.
I love that movie, dude. So it was like one of the first movies that first grown-up movies that I remember watching. So maybe that's why I liked it so much, because it was like, sneaking up, staying up really late. It was back in the day whenever we used to watch, movies on TV that had ads in them, like commercial breaks every 30 minutes or 20 minutes or something.
Can I just say, in fairness, I think I would have liked that movie a lot more if I'd seen it when I was like 8 years old. So, so anyway, continue.
And I Googled it before having this conversation. I was like, that movie came out in 2000. Like, wow.
Yeah.
That is really, really crazy. But for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's like, I think it's an absolute cult classic. Steve disagrees, clearly. He's made his opinions very vocal and evident, which is fine,
I'm an ivory tower snob. I admit it. I'm leaning into it right now. But go ahead. Yes, please.
So I love it because, Bruce Willis, he kind of slowly realizes that he's a superhero. I think it's a fresh take on the superhero genre. And he's kind of like, he survives this like train crash and there's a bunch of other things start happening. And he's like, wait, is there something weird about me? And he turns out it's just like this genetic freak that just can't die. He's like indestructible and he's got all these other things. And I was thinking about, like, are there people in the world that are somewhat like that mentally, where they can walk around where they don't experience pain, they don't experience fear, or, to really bring it home for today's conversation, they don't experience anxiety? Because it is something that we all face, but are there a select few walking among us that just don't know what that feels like?
So yeah, it turns out there are people that absolutely lack the brain circuitry to have fear. And it's incredible. So there's a really famous case, and thank God it's really unusual. It's quite rare. There's a famous case in the literature. Her name is, for obvious reasons, she has to remain anonymous because people take extraordinary advantage of this poor young woman. So she's just known by her initials, SM. And she presented to one of the world's most famous neuroscientists, a guy named Antonio Damasio, in San Diego. And the basic deal was her family were terrified for her because she had no capacity to experience fear.
Wow.
And so she would walk right up to like sketchy looking dudes in the park who called her over, hey, come here, I got something for you. And she had been robbed at knife point twice, robbed at gunpoint 3 times,
oh my goodness,
had been brutally beaten. Her first husband was a psychopath and nearly beat her to death before she left him. And she had, they put her in a brain scan and were alarmed to discover that the central hub of emotional processing, we've talked about it before, it's called the amygdala. It's shaped like an almond. In fact, pro tip for the kids out there, amygdala is the Latin word for almond, okay?
No way!
Way.
Dude,
amygdala
I eat like 50 grams of amygdalas every day. I love them. Very much.
So the early neuroscientists, they're like, hey, what's this piece of the brain? It looks like an almond. We're going to call it the amygdala. And then later, of course, we discovered the amygdala is the central hub of raw emotional processing, but it is ground zero for our fear circuits, okay? This young woman, her amygdalas had completely calcified. She had a very rare syndrome, and I mean, it's tragic. The rest of her brain was normal and intact. She was intellectually normal, but she had no ability. She was almost like somebody who's colorblind. She was blind to the possibility of fear or a related emotion we're going to talk about a lot, anxiety, and completely debilitating. And you know what it reminded me of? Probably, Hugh, you've heard about these folks, medical cases of people who cannot experience physical pain, back to your unbreakable
crazy
thing, right? Yeah. And by the way, if a person were truly unbreakable, then it would be awesome if they couldn't experience pain. Pain is a signal of tissue damage or likely tissue damage. And we hate pain, and yet turns out we can't live without it. Why? Because there are some folks who have a neurological syndrome, they don't have pain receptors. And, a lot of times they will have horrible tissue damage that they're blind to. And a lot of people without pain will experience amputations. I know it's grisly to talk about, but I think it just vividly illustrates the point. Emotional pain, like physical pain, is there for a reason. We absolutely need it. We can view our emotional pain potentially as friendly, but here's the thing. Not all physical pain is a true valid signal, right? There are people that have chronic pain syndromes. There are people that have phantom limb pain, right? Back to amputation.
Like, I know a guy who's lost his leg, and he talked to me on like, the first 6 months after it happened, and he was like, it's so annoying because my shin has been so itchy and I don't even have a shin. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, that's absolutely crazy.
Yeah. Pain is incredibly helpful when it's a true signal, when it's an accurate signal. But if we get a signal of pain and it's not referencing anything real, now it's simply pure suffering. And unneeded, unwanted, unnecessary suffering. And that's what anxiety disorders are like for people. They're experiencing emotional pain that in the right context would be absolutely life-saving, except now, like phantom limb pain, it's like phantom anxiety, phantom fear.
Wow.
It's tormenting them, but it's not referencing anything actually real. Or if it is referencing something real, it's wildly overstated and overamplified.
You're coming in hot today. I had a lot more things to say there, but you know what? I'm actually just going to leave it there because when someone comes in on fire like that, you just got to give them a little bit of space. So yeah, look, hello, welcome to Mental Health. This is the podcast where we discuss the latest tools, the cutting edge research and ancient practices to take back control of your emotional well-being. My name's Hugh James. I hope to be as hot as Steve is here in a couple of minutes. I'm a podcaster and I'm a writer from Northern Ireland that's been on a journey towards healing from addiction and depression over the last 15 years.
And I'm Steve Ilardi, and I hate this part of the podcast. I hate introducing myself.
I'm in your head now. You're like, no, I came in strong. I have to carry it.
You ever watch a basketball game? And the announcers are like, oh my God, player X is on fire. And then
he's got a hot hand and proceeds to miss 20.
Yeah, absolutely. It never fails. So thank you for that. I'm Steve Ilardi, and I'm a psychologist. I'm a researcher. I'm a clinician, and mostly I am a fellow traveler with you. I absolutely love being able to be a part of your life, and this is what we do. We believe mental health is the most important foundation for living your best possible life. So it's our mission every episode to help you feel more informed, more empowered, and encouraged on your own journey.
So yeah, today's episode is the third installation in our 101 series where Steve and I are taking the deep dive into some of the most mental into some of the most common mental disorders that our world faces today. So far, we have done ADHD 101, we've done Addiction 101, and along the way, we want to help lay out what causes these disorders, what's actually going on in our brains when we're experiencing these symptoms, and most importantly, give some really practical takeaways and tools and steps that we can all take to better equip ourselves against these, as Steve kind of beautifully laid out in the intro there, very human conditions that often play an important role, but can sometimes take us into the dark side of them rather than helping us flourish and thrive. So,
yeah. Okay, let's do it.
What an opening. Let's go. How can we ever recover from this? I guess like where I would like to start is like, how do we diagnose anxiety disorders? Anxiety is one of those things that I feel like, do I even know what it is? Like, it's so broad, and you hear people saying like, oh, I have anxiety. Some of them have been diagnosed, some of them haven't. They say I'm feeling anxious today. And I'm just going to level with everyone, like straight off the top of the episode. This is not a spectrum that I really find myself on. I definitely am on the addiction spectrum. I'm definitely on the depression spectrum. But this is something that I find hard to relate to people with, and I find hard to actually understand. So give me, I guess, the 101 on anxiety here. This is what we're here to do today.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, full disclosure, Hugh may not be able to connect directly with anxiety. I can. right?
Well,
This
you
is
know what? If it's not one, it's the other. This is why this marriage works perfectly.
absolutely, man. Yeah, I'm wired that way. I come by it honestly because so many of my close genetic relatives are wired that way. And yeah, genetics matters. We'll circle back around to that. Now, having said that, I don't want you to feel bad for me because I've for the last 30 years have been putting into practice so many of the tools we're going to be talking about here today. And I am in a nice sort of place of homeostasis, of equilibrium,
Good.
not suffering. Yeah, and I don't say that in any other way other than to say, look, if a neurotic, high-strung guy like me can find a way to just be at a nice equilibrium and not be suffering with any kind of elevated anxiety, then I believe just about anybody can. So, all right, back to your question. How do we diagnose anxiety? All right. In our diagnostic Bible, we've talked about this, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, version 5. We have 5 major anxiety diagnoses, right? Not just one.
That
We don't
seems
say, oh, you have
like
clinical.
a lot.
Oh, but wait, it gets better. We have 2 adjacent diagnoses as
Ding,
well.
ding,
So we really
ding.
kind of, yeah. So we really
Bonus.
all right. Now, before I list them, and I'm going to list them really quickly, I just want to say that we do not diagnose anyone with an anxiety disorder unless their anxiety and its associated symptoms is causing suffering and or usually both impairment of function at a high level, like substantial impairment of function and suffering. Okay.
So that already helps because it's a difference between like me waking up one day and saying like, oh, I feel kind of anxious today, as we do in our week to week or at least our month to month, versus I have a full blown diagnosable disorder that's causing me a lot of pain in my daily life.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really fun when I teach in abnormal psychology, when I teach about phobias. And I asked for a show of hands, like how many, and we'll give some examples of like the people that are afraid of pickles, or the people that are afraid of.
Sorry, I really shouldn't have laughed, but
it
came out of nowhere. It came out of nowhere, dude. Sorry.
Oh man, and I'm stepping all over our upcoming Phobias 101 episode. So maybe I should just shut up right now, because man, could I tell you about some weird phobias? But they're weird, but they're human, right? I mean, we can be afraid of anything.
Yeah.
But the question is, okay. How many people have a really irrational fear that freaks them out? And it's like 70% of the population. But how many people have a diagnosable phobia that's actually interfering with their life and causing function? Well, now we're looking at about 1 out of every 10 people or so, right? So all of these diagnoses, they're really serious. They're really, they're intruding. So what do we got? Well, I think probably the most intuitive we call generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And those are the people that are just chronically anxiously aroused and worrying all the time. And that's going to be the major focus of today's episode because it is so common and, or relatively common at least. And even those of us who don't have diagnosable GAD, can kind of relate to it. Many of us. Okay. So there's generalized, there's social anxiety disorder, which is its own thing. And we're going to spend time in an upcoming episode talking about that. There are the phobias that I just mentioned, and we could diagnose those. There's something called panic disorder for people who have panic attacks. We'll circle back to that. There's agoraphobia, people that are incredibly, debilitatingly afraid of public spaces, usually, or situations where they're afraid there won't be any help if they have a panic attack. Then we also have 2 related disorders. There's post-traumatic stress, or PTSD, and then obsessive compulsive, or OCD. And we may cover those in future episodes as well.
Okay. Wow. So like you kind of lost me at generalized anxiety disorder. I think that's the one that I know about whenever, or one of my friends says to me, like, I'm feeling anxious. I think that's primarily probably what they're talking about. Phobias, I get. Social anxiety, yeah, I can get my head around that. Panic disorder, less so. Maybe could look into that a little bit more. And I have heard cases of agoraphobia. I know, like, we've covered this before in episode 2, the second ever episode we ever did about anxiety and the pandemic. But could you go over it just again?
Do it again? Yeah.
People like me who were sitting at the back of the class with their feet up, who maybe like forgot to take notes. Like, what actually is anxiety? So you've given like 5 diagnosable different types of anxiety, but if you were even to like zoom out further, like on the big picture, like what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah. Okay, so can I stop just for a second? Like hit the pause. I mean, you can keep recording if you want, but I think what I'd like to do is come at this from a little bit of a sideways angle with a question.
Oh, spicy.
Yeah, okay.
I'm keeping this in. Let's do it, whatever
All
it
right,
is.
let's
I'm
do
riding
it.
or dying.
Oh, let's go. What is the difference between fear and panic and anxiety? Are they the same thing, different things? It turns out, no, they are different things. Here we go. Fear is that extraordinarily intense emotion that we all have when we perceive that there is something threatening and it is right here. It's imminent. It is now. It's going down. The
gun
there's
held up to my face.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's a knife-wielding madman running across the room directly at me. My life is in danger, or somebody that I care about is in danger. And now I'm in full-blown fight or flight alarm mode. It's on. The adrenaline's pumping. It's literally in the next 30 seconds. I have to move vigorously to save my life or that of somebody that I care about, or at least to get out of harm's way. Okay, that's fear. We all know it. Panic is exactly that alarm response, except now it's going off when there is no objective danger.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when people talk about a panic attack, or at least when clinicians talk about a panic attack, it's like, oh, yeah, that horrible sensation of your heart's pumping out of your chest. You can hear your heart. Actually, it's pounding so hard. And yet you look around and there's nothing. Okay. And that in and of itself is so unnerving and so horrifying that it actually, when it recurs as an out of the blue kind of thing, it's its own diagnosis, and it can be really horribly disabling. Okay.
So fear without the threat.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. The full-blown alarm response, but it is now a false alarm. Okay. That's panic. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a low-grade version of that. We're not in alarm mode, but we're kind of revving up the engine. It's like we're getting more aroused. Our heart's pumping harder, but it's not pumping out of our chest. We've got some adrenaline, but it's not flooding the system. We are basically, you know what we're perceiving? Here's the cognitive, the mental component of anxiety. We are perceiving that there is a threat. It's looming on the horizon. It may or may not fully emerge. It's not here right now, but it's coming, or at least I'm worried that it's coming. So I'm going to worry about it. I'm going to be vigilant for it. I'm going to shift my attention. And we don't do this consciously, but unconsciously, when we're anxious, our attention narrows so that we only pick up on threat cues and we filter out all kinds of other really, really useful, important information because it's not relevant to this threat. It's an adaptation. If there's really, truly a danger lurking, then anxiety could save your life. But again, there can be, just like false alarms that are panic, there can be false perception of threat or wildly inflated.
It's a little bit twofold then with anxiety. The first one is it's so hard to give a definition of anxiety without using the word anxiety. It is the potential of future threat or a future negative situation. That's one
absolutely.
kind of bucket. But then the other bucket can also be that the alarm bells are going off at the wrong time. There's a malfunction in the smoke alarm and it thinks that there might be smoke even though there's no way there is.
Yeah, and that would be the difference between adaptive anxiety, right? So again, it's good to be anxious if there really is a threat looming, right? So if somebody's in the Ukraine right now, we're recording this in early March. If somebody's in Ukraine, then their situation objectively got much more dangerous over the past month.
For sure.
And so it would be maladaptive for them not to be more anxious. They should be more anxious if their brain is functioning and their mind are functioning normally. Now, it doesn't mean that they should be disabled by anxiety, right? But an appropriate level of anxious arousal can be enormously helpful. But there are lots and lots, millions of people walking around with super high levels of anxiety that are very poorly calibrated with the objective threat or danger that may be looming. Even though we live in a world full of potential threat, our ancestors have always inhabited a potentially dangerous world. But, objectively speaking, our world today is much safer than that of most of our ancestors, which I know sounds kind of weird to say, and we can take a deep dive on that some other time. We don't even have to leave that in. But I think it's important just to point out, like, there's nothing unusual about living in a world where there could be some danger lurking. That's always been true, not just of the human condition, but of any living organism. And so, the question is not should we ever be anxious or not, but just what's the appropriate level of anxiety to experience.
Yeah, really interesting. I give you a little, it's all becoming clearer as I hear you speak. Like, anecdotally, I would say that I live my life very differently now than when I did when I lived in Manhattan. Because you kind of always kind of have that, like, I guess it's a form of anxiety. You have the low grade sensitivity scanning of the environment, you're in the subway late at night and you can go really, really quickly into like response mode. Whereas like I'm walking around my village here in Ireland and I'm like, not looking for any threats whatsoever. I listened to a really funny, I know we mentioned him in the addictions episodes. I listened to a really great interview with Bradley Cooper and he talked about him getting mugged in the New York City subway, and he was just saying, dude, I just got way too comfortable in New York. And he said like he was walking around with like his hands in his pockets, like leaning against like the thing late at night. He had his noise cancelling headphones on and he just felt he was in his living room in the subway car, and he was like, I probably shouldn't have been like that, and I need to bring that healthy level of anxiety back. So let me ask you this, because I come at this topic of anxiety with like my depression brain, okay? And I hear a lot of my friends with anxiety talking about like how their body feels anxious, or there's all these kind of like bodily cues. And okay, we can talk about it when we do Depression 101. There's a lot of kind of physical things, but it doesn't seem to be that obvious. When I'm in a state of depression, it's not like, I don't know, my shoulders like tense up and I've got like this very visible thing going on. So could you explain like what the body does and some of the physical effects that anxiety can have on like our bodies, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good call, Hugh, because I think most of the people that I've worked with, and I should just say at the outset, I've worked now in my career with literally over 100 people with various anxiety diagnoses, probably a few hundred. Almost all of them, when I ask, I love to ask the question, like, how do you know when you're anxious? What do you feel? What do you notice? And the thing that really jumps out, if you start asking people that question, what do you notice when you're anxious? You find that people notice two things. They notice what's going on in their mind and they notice what's going on in their body. So let's take the body first, then we can circle back to the other one later. What do they notice in their body? Well, some people notice, as I mentioned earlier, that their heart's beating faster. Some people notice their breathing is wonky, like maybe they're hyperventilating or they're just having trouble getting their breath. They might notice that their hands are sweaty, their palms are sweaty, or they feel trembly, or they feel flush, or they feel lightheaded, right? It basically, all of these different reactions are part of a nervous system response that goes out from the brainstem through special like broadband connections to all of our major tissues that are running on adrenaline or a chemical cousin of adrenaline, and they're just getting us ready to move, right? We talked about that alarm response is like getting us prepped to move for physical danger. That's what people tend to notice. And by the way, it gives us a really big hint about the function of anxiety. Remember we said that with fear, the danger is right here, right now. With anxiety, it's like it might happen. So what happens when we're anxious? The body is getting warmed up. It's getting ready so that if that danger, if that feared thing actually does emerge in 1 minute or 10 minutes or 1 hour, that we're ready to pounce, we're ready to sprint. And the analogy that I like to use is just like, here in Kansas, it gets really cold sometimes in the winter. And for people who park their car outside, if they are running late in the morning, running late to work or wherever they're trying to get to, and it's below freezing, and they need to just go jump in the car, turn on the ignition, and sprint down the highway, they're going to find usually the car is not able to do that. It's
So
not able.
my
Yeah.
glow plugs, which I had no idea what they were until we got a diesel car, have actually completely gone out at the minute. And it takes our car like a good 30 seconds to start up. I'm like, and for the first time, like we were driving around this like awesome little like beat up car for, years and years and years. And the battery.
A beater.
Yeah, exactly. And the battery died all the time. And I was like, oh no, is the battery dying in our new car? And it was like, no. Like just the spark plugs have gone and they just need to be changed because they give the engine a little helping hand to warm up. So yeah, I'm right there with you with the 30-second chugging at the minute.
Yeah. And so what do we do if we're in that situation? If we're smart, if we're proactive, we go out and we start the car like 5 minutes before we actually need to drive away, right? So we run out into the cold, sprint, turn on the ignition, run back inside, finish doing whatever we're doing, gathering up all our stuff. And then we come back out and it's had that 5 minutes to warm up. And now if we've got to get on the on-ramp to the interstate, soon after we take off, the car is going to respond. It will actually give us that acceleration if we mash the pedal to the floor. That's the same with our body. If we are completely calm and centered and relaxed, and then an emergency appears out of nowhere, we're actually going to be a little slower to boot up completely into alarm mode. And so anxiety is a really cool evolutionary adaptation that's been selected over the millennia, over the eons, to give us an advantage, to get us warmed up. And by the way, I mentioned earlier the mental aspect of anxiety, because there's the bottom, sort of the bottom up, coming from our bodies, getting us revved up, getting the adrenaline flowing to some degree. But then in the brain, in the mind, there's this shift in perception, the shift in attention, where now we are clued in to, hey, does that look like it could be sketchy? Does that look dangerous? So, if the person's walking around 2 a.m. in some kind of sketchy neighborhood in, Upper Manhattan or something, they're a little more vigilant.
Yeah, 100%.
A little more cautious. And just like I gave the example of SM, where she had no fear circuitry, we know that, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are. If you have no capacity to adjust your behavior in the presence of potential danger, then it's gonna end badly.
That's
no matter where we are.
really, really interesting. So again, like I love whenever people put words to lived experience. I often say to people, like, it's why I do the drug of podcasting. It's like my endless pursuit of trying to find words to explain things that have happened to me and people that I love. And just what you said there, like it's getting off the train on 181st Street in New York, and there's a big group of guys with their hoods up, and there is that, like, the way movies interpret this, it's almost like that, like your vision gets focused, you have this like electricity running through your hands, you're on alert, you're ready to move or take action, like really, 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 really quickly. And it's this incredible thing. And I guess that's anxiety working in a healthy way, like preparing you, getting the engine ready to engage or run away, depending on what the situation requires. If
absolutely
it gets to that point.
If it gets to that point. And again, back to the sort of mantra for today's episode, it has to be well calibrated. And the problem for so many millions of people is their body and their mind, their brain are in a state in which it's basically telling them you're in that really, really dangerous temporary situation all the time.
Wow.
Like, in other words, you just have to be revved up all the time because everything is dangerous and it's all going to go down at any moment. And it's exhausting.
Yeah, I was just about to say, exhausting.
Exhausting. And by the way, our world shrinks when we're anxious. And so you know what happens when people are anxious all the time? They miss out. They miss out on so many opportunities because in order to really maximize our ability to carpe the diem, right? To seize.
That's gotta be like, I didn't know that was on my bucket list, but to hear you abuse Latin, because you've used Latin in almost every episode we've done.
Oh,
and so to hear you abuse it was actually very refreshing.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll be here all week, ladies and gentlemen. To carpe the diem. You know, people who are anxious cannot carpe diem. They cannot seize the day. They cannot. How about this? They cannot live their best possible life. They cannot, because we have to get to a place where we can be a little expansive, where we can be positioned to grow and expand and pursue opportunities that may or may not pan out, and to be okay with that. It's like, all right, yeah, things may not go as I dream, but man, I'm going to chase that dream. And if we're anxious, we are so much less likely to follow our dream. We're so much less likely to take a chance on like, oh, I think I could be friends with that person, but it might not work out. What could possibly go wrong? By the way, spoiler, the superpower of anxiety is the ability to anticipate what could possibly go wrong, which can be an enormous gift in certain settings, but can also take us out of our best possible life.
Can I just jump in and give a completely off-topic little nugget here?
Go for it.
So I have this kind of belief that every podcast has like a mythical guest that they dream of getting that just keeps coming up again and again and again. And I'm just going to put this out there and I'm going to leave it in the episode for the sake of posterity, so that like in 50 or 100 episodes time, when it happens, we can call back to this very, very moment. I think we're going to get Bradley Cooper on the podcast. Like,
I'd love it.
That is one of those, like in another podcast I was a part of, it was Liam Neeson. It was like, gotta get lame. It was a podcast to do with Ireland. And I think with this, because like Carpe Diem, wasn't that the big thing in Silver Linings Playbook?
Oh yeah, there you go.
I'm like, dude, like Bradley is in the DNA of this show. So there you go. Just throwing it in there for the sake of the ability to clip it later on.
Hugh, are you speaking that into existence? Are you?
I'm
doing
just
like the
manifesting this.
Manifest, yeah.
You know, like I'm gonna put it up on my wall every day and just look at it and think about it. And next thing you know, Bradley's gonna show up at my front door, dude. It's gonna be awesome.
I love it. Every time you say manifesting, the little scientist within me just sort of shudders. It's like, my little inner thought bubble is like it's filled with big capital W's and T's and F's.
That's so awesome. I do want to go back to something you said, though. You used this lovely phrase where you talked about like bottom up causes. And then you talked about the body and you talked about the mind. Maybe that's an interesting kind of little hook for us to actually move into this next part where like, what causes anxiety? So like beyond the gang of thugs or the lion that shows up at your front door, like what's going on in the body and the mind that actually causes that anxiety or that anxious feeling? Maybe you want to start with the body.
I love it. Yeah. So of course in the body, that whole, if you think of it like the orchestra of all the possible parts of the body that are going to respond and get us ready to move, respond to threat, the conductor is the brain. And within the brain, there are different players or different experts that kind of have different roles that they're going to play. So the prefrontal cortex, that's, you know, probably everybody's heard the frontal or prefrontal. Prefrontal, by the way, pro tip, is just the part of the frontal cortex that is closest to the eyeballs.
Okay.
So it's like before the front. If you're doing an autopsy on somebody and you're tunneling in from the eye socket, from the orbital
tunneling
cavity.
Is such a graphic word. Wow.
I'm sorry about that, but yeah, you may want to take that out. I don't know. So the prefrontal cortex is the most advanced, evolutionarily the most novel, the most advanced, but also pro tip, the least debugged part of the brain, because it's the newest and it's still kind of buggy. Which is one of the reasons why, like, say, we struggle to play chess and think 10 moves ahead, but we can program a computer to do it effortlessly. And yet the more evolutionarily ancient parts of the brain do all kinds of stuff that we are struggling to program computers and robots to do. Like, you know, say, do a triple axel jump on a pair of ice skates or something. All right. So the prefrontal cortex gives us our conscious, logical appraisal of threat. So like, what is the actual level of threat as we think about it? You know, if we're in a situation where it's like, oh, I'm hiking on a trail and I know that it's a time of year when there could be snakes and I know that there are venomous snakes on this trail sometimes. Like, okay, my prefrontal cortex is going to be feeding into the rest of my brain saying, be on the lookout, right? Then a little bit lower down, there's the cingulate cortex, which is basically like just the layer below the prefrontal. So a little bit more ancient, and it does something really cool. It's called error detection. It's basically the part of the brain that's tasked with like always comparing in any given moment, like, okay, what just happened compared to what I thought was going to happen? Are things going okay, or is there something wrong? Is there some glitch in the system? Did something unexpected just occur? You know that feeling, Hugh, you get when you, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but like you leave the front door and you start taking a few steps away from the house and you have that sensation like something's wrong. Like, oh, did I forget to do the thing? Was I supposed to turn off the burner? Did I forget to lock the door? You follow? Like
yeah.
That nagging sensation, like, there's something that's off. Cingulate cortex does that. It gives us that error detection.
Does this also, like, if I'm out on that same trail you're talking about and I see what I think is a snake, and then on further inspection, it's just like a little stick? Is that like the error detection where it's like, it's a snake. Oh, no, just kidding. It's just a stick. Or like you hear a loud bang and you're like, oh no, is it a gunshot? And you're like, oh no, like my daughter just popped a balloon.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, it turns out that the a little further down, the tissue that we talked about just a minute ago, the amygdala, actually does the quick and dirty, like the super lightning fast appraisal of could it be a threat or not. So like if you're walking on the trail, let's use that example. You're walking on the trail, you see something snake-like, and you immediately startle. That's your amygdala saying snake-like. Take no chances, jump back, go into defensive posture, hit the alarm, and then 2 seconds later, your prefrontal cortex gets the memo and it's like consciously evaluating and it's like, oh yeah, that's actually just a twig. Your error detection circuits are sort of sitting there in the middle and they're noticing like, okay, I wasn't expecting, okay, let's make the story even just slightly more complicated. Let's say it's a time of year when you really are not on the lookout for snakes at all. And now that's an error. It's a predictive error because your brain is just like, no, this is going to be fine, smooth sailing.
It's definitely not a snake. It has to be a stick because it's February, because everyone knows snakes don't come out in February or something.
Exactly. Yeah, something like that. Error detection, though, is really prominent in people with generalized anxiety, people that suffer from clinical anxiety, because they are constantly walking around with this sensation of like, I don't know, it doesn't feel right. It's just like this itch inside their brain. And by the way, we see it most prominently with people who have a lot of pathological worry that are like, oh, I haven't heard from my loved one who's like driving to the airport or they're driving back, and it's only a 40-minute drive and it's been 45 minutes and they haven't texted. Right? And it's like, oh my God. And now they start thinking of like all the possible things that could have possibly gone wrong. And they have that very visceral reaction that's coming from this pretty primitive part of the brain that's like, you better worry.
Wow.
Because things are not right. Okay.
It's like the hijacking, like just the image that came into my head whenever you were sharing that is that, you know, we talked about how addiction kind of hijacks the reward circuits of the brain. In some ways, like anxiety is hijacking the, I don't know, caution, like circuits of the brain, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know what? I'm gonna get a little bit ahead of ourselves, maybe get out over the tip of our skis just a little bit, but I think this is really going to be useful. So when people ask me like, okay, if I take a medication for anxiety and it works, what's it doing? And one of the things it's doing is it's calming down those error detection circuits.
Crazy.
The cingulate cortex, it's basically calming it down, turning down its activity and saying basically like, you got this, it's okay. that visceral feeling that's very hard to put words to, but that feeling that something is not right and I need to start worrying and I need to just brood and ruminate, it turns that down. Now, pro tip, it is very difficult to get that perfectly calibrated. And many times I have seen patients who go on an anxiety medication and they get that relief by turning down the error detection, but then it goes too far. Now, how do you know if it's gone too far? So I have literally worked with a few different students who were not only high-level straight A students, but they're in a very ambitious regimen like pre-med school or pre-PhD, who, when they took a drug that turned down their error detection, all of a sudden they just didn't give a about their classes.
Wow.
Yeah. So like I literally had a patient who was, straight A student, pre-med, senior year, and she had gone on a medication for her migraines, but that it was an antidepressant, had these anti-anxiety properties, turned down her cingulate cortex. And all of a sudden she's just like, yeah, she shows up one day and she's like, yeah, I just, it's weird. I don't really care about my classes anymore. I've been skipping class. I just got my first F on an assignment. And, this was alarming. To her, she was just completely insouciant, completely just unconcerned. And, a week later when it was still going on, I had her contact her neurologist, and she went off the med immediately and came back in, and she's like, what the hell was that all about? Like, she was really rattled. She was like, I was literally going to throw away my med school career.
But that's the scary thing about the brain that I think a lot of us are kind of attracted to, for anyone who likes to learn about this sort of stuff, is like, who are we? You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to completely derail us, but like all the things that we think are us and parts of our personality, like, you take one little drug and all of a sudden you don't want to be a doctor anymore. You're like, wait, what? Like, I thought that's like in my bones, in my like passionate DNA, but it's really interesting.
Yeah. She had dreamed of being a doctor since she was 8 years old. She had worked toward that dream for well over a decade, about 13 years. And now, by the way, I'm not saying this to alarm our listeners. I do not have an anti-medication agenda. By the way, I have seen a very similar thing happen for somebody who started taking high-dose fish oil, which can also, it turns out, by virtue of affecting serotonin signaling in the brain, it can also occasionally have a really big effect on the cingulate cortex, on those error detection circuits. And, I think really the take home from all of this is that we just need to be more savvy and more aware of the possibilities. Again, not to freak out, not to say, oh my God, if that's possible, then we should never use these drugs or these powerful nutraceuticals like high-dose fish oil. But, just to be aware, like, okay, I should probably have eyes on. How about this, Hugh? If I'm going to take a drug that could change my brain in such a way that it changes my personality, not permanently, but while I'm on this drug, I probably should have somebody that I really trust, who's checking in with me, who's watching me, who's, there as a confidant to alert me to the possibility that this might be bringing about some changes that are not beneficial.
So talk to me about hormones.
Yeah. So,
because I've heard like a lot of friends, like female friends, talk a lot about the hormonal aspect of certain medications or how their anxiety affects their hormone system. Like, what's going on there across the board with hormones?
Yeah. So first of all, we should probably talk about reproductive hormones. So why? Because they cross into the brain and they have massive effects that really are relevant for anxiety. So let's start with the most obviously sex-typed reproductive hormone, which is testosterone, and related hormones we call androgens. So there are lots of testosterone-adjacent hormones as well. Their levels are, on average, about 20 times higher in men than in women. They have effects in the female brain as well. But when we look at broad sex differences, and we always want to put a little asterisk by that. It's like, yes, there are exceptions. Yes, these are overlapping distributions. But in general, women are about twice as likely as men to have clinical anxiety.
Wow.
Yeah. Women are about twice as likely as men to have clinical anxiety. Now, no, for those who are wondering, and it's a good question, is it an artifact of diagnosticians being more vigilant, right? Maybe doctors are quicker on the draw to make a diagnosis for women? No, that's not it. How do we know? Really carefully controlled, conducted studies. That's not what's going on here. The ratio is 1-to-1 in childhood. It's only once the reproductive hormones kick in that we see these dramatic differences, and we can manipulate hormone levels and manipulate anxiety levels at the same time. So we absolutely know this is not a spurious correlation. Testosterone is an anti-anxiety hormone. Under the influence of testosterone, our anxiety levels generally will drop, which is absolutely fascinating. Now that sounds like, well, why don't we just all have massive levels of testosterone?
I mean, I ask myself that question every day.
yeah, I know. And it turns out that, there's a downside to having too much. Can I just call it tea from now on?
You can call
too much
it tea. Yeah.
In the business, we call it tea.
In the bodybuilding community, we call it tea,
Oh, dude, you're so. What is the word you taught me? Swole? Is that a word?
Did I teach you that word? I'm embarrassed that I taught you that. Wow.
But tea is anti-anxiety. It's antidepressant. What else? Well, estrogen. Estrogen is present in men and women, much higher in women. But the thing about estrogen for women is levels fluctuate wildly over the span of any given month during the menstrual cycle for women of reproductive age, but then postpartum after giving birth and leading up to birth, and then in the so-called perimenopausal window leading up to menopause, the 5 years or so before menopause, when hormone levels are just bouncing all over the map for a lot of women. And it is no coincidence that it's in those particular windows that we see huge spikes in anxiety levels for a lot of women. Now, it's not just estrogen. There's a related reproductive hormone people have heard of called progesterone. And progesterone has a chemical cousin called allopregnanolone. Yeah, try saying that 3 times quickly. Now, I know this is like super geeky, deep science, but there's a payoff here. Allopregnanolone is basically a natural Xanax without the addictive potential. Allopregnanolone has massive anti-anxiety effects in the brain. And it hits the same receptors in the brain. They're called GABA, for gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA. Same receptors that a drug like Xanax or Ativan or Klonopin will hit. And so when progesterone levels drop sharply, say during the end of the menstrual cycle or postpartum or during perimenopause, then for many, many women, their anxiety levels will skyrocket because their allopregnanolone levels are dropping. Now, the cherry on top of this cake is that drug companies have figured out how to synthesize allopregnanolone and deliver it to the body in the form of a pill. It is one of the most recently approved psychiatric medications. Wait, I just said in the form of a pill. They're working on that. Right now, all they have is an injection, as far as I know. But anyway, the FDA just approved it a couple of years ago. Its first approval is for postpartum depression and anxiety, but it looks like it's going to have much, much broader psychiatric potential.
Crazy. So again, because we just did addiction's kind of top of mind for me. We did talk quite a lot about the genetic component to addiction. What's going on with anxiety when it comes to our genes?
Well, okay, big picture. Genes affect so much more about our personality, about our functioning, about our mental health than anyone suspected 40, 50 years ago. When I was an undergrad 40 years ago, nobody talked about genes when it came to the human condition. Or if they did, there was a little bit of hand waving about, there are these rare genetic conditions. Sure. But basically the thinking was our genes are just garden variety. They program a blank slate human mind, and then it's all about conditioning and learning and what happens to you.
Do you know what I would like to do at some point? I'd really like to do an episode with you titled like things I've changed my mind about over the course of my career. Something like that. I think that would be really cool. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So, well, this is one of those things I've changed my mind about. Why? There's a famous quote where some politician is getting raked over the coals for changing his position. And he says, well, hey, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? It's like, yeah, the facts have changed. The evidence has changed. Now we have overwhelming evidence that genes account for about 1/2 of the story. If you want to predict just about anything about a person's personality, like how extroverted are they, how open to experience, how conscientious. But when it comes to mental health outcomes, genes typically account for anywhere between about 30% and 80% of the story, depending on the particular disorder. With anxiety, it's about half the story. And why? Because genes are the operating system inside every brain cell. They are the real-time operating system. Yes, they also are the recipe book for building a brain while we're developing, gestating in the womb, but they do so much more than that. And so we cannot escape the profound impact of our genetics. Having said that, genes are not destiny fully. They're probabilistic destiny. So I shared earlier that I have genetic proclivities. I'm certain, because of all my family history, I have a genetic tendency toward high anxiety and neuroticism. But I've worked extremely hard over a lifetime to counter that effect. And so let's just say hypothetically, my genes might program me to be like top 5% anxiety, or maybe top 10%. Right now, I'm probably like 50th percentile, middle of the pack.
Wow.
So genes are probabilistic destiny, but we can still work to counter their effects.
So, like, bring it all home for me here and explain to me, if I have a genetic predisposition towards anxiety, what does that actually mean? Like, what is happening in my brain, say, in comparison to this other person walking down the street? Like, what's the biological differences between someone who is anxiety prone and someone who's not?
Yeah, brilliant question. So it's going to be almost certainly a bottom-up effect. In other words, the way in which the genes have programmed the brain's fear circuitry, the brain's stress response circuitry, the hormonal system in the body. So just as for example, I mentioned the brain chemical that everybody's heard of, serotonin. And serotonin circuitry in the brain is regulated by this really complex system of receptors, docking ports that, can receive the information of serotonin, as well as things that like make serotonin or break it down or transport it back up into the brain cell after it's been released during signaling, like lots and lots of little fine-grained details. And all of those details are programmed by our genes. So small genetic effects in basically individual differences in how serotonin functions can then have ripple effects. Why? Because serotonin regulates activity in those error detection circuits. So in the cingulate cortex.
I could use a really stupid metaphor here and tell me if it's like roughly on the right track. So I was fixing a door in our house the other day and the hinge was kind of wonky on it. And I moved the hinge and I moved it like maybe, I don't know, like half a centimeter in the wrong direction. And the ripple effect of that by the time it actually came to like where the door meets the door frame was huge. Like, so like one small little like error on the hinge level equated to like 5 centimeter difference, like on the actual door frame level.
That's beautiful. Absolutely. So small genetic changes or differences that, especially as they build up in different parts of the genome, and now they're expressed as the brain is being wired up, and then the operating system the brain cells use in real time. Those little tiny differences can have massive impacts as they're amplified through the system. The other thing I should mention is really quickly, back to the amygdala, ground zero for fear and anxiety responding at a very low basic subconscious, unconscious, preconscious level, right? Like that startle response when you, like in 0.4 of a second, jump back from the snake-like looking thing. It's not a very high level response, but it's super primitive, very emotionally intense. The amygdala is largely under genetic control in terms of how it wires itself up to the rest of the brain. It's a grand central station. It's a hub of input and output that goes all over the brain, including down to the brainstem, down to the sympathetic nervous system, which is, again, the broadband connection that connects the brain to the heart and to the lungs, and to the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys that release other stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. So it's a very complicated system, and a lot of its wiring is regulated by genes. So if you have anxious wiring, then you are going to have a strong predisposition to get anxious more easily, to stay anxious longer after you've been aroused, to have a harder time turning it off. Conversely, though, there are people that are wired genetically to have pretty average or even low anxiety, but experience changes the brain. Experience changes the body. So experience, I believe, has changed my brain for the better. So, maybe I've gone from 95th percentile anxiety to 50th. There are people that might start at, the 10th percentile. So they're super low anxiety, but they experience horrible, massive trauma. Lots of events that basically tell the brain, you inhabit a very dangerous world. You need to permanently change your level of expression of the different receptors that kick your stress response into high gear. And so now that person, not because of their genes, but because of their experience. By the way, there's a fancy word, epigenetic, that I think a lot of people know. Epigenetic just means the way in which your experience changes how your genes work. There are people that have had these horrible, traumatic, scary experiences that now have an epigenetic change that makes their brain more like that of somebody who was just kind of hardwired to be anxious.
So that makes sense. Like all that physical stuff, the genetic components, what's going on in the brain. What I just find very disorientating or confusing about anxiety is you've outlined this like biological, physical side to it, which I've never really heard before. Yet there seems to also be this like huge mental side to it where like
Yes.
the mind is impacting the body, but then like how much does the body impact the mind? I'm just like, it's a strange sort of like paradox where it's like the thoughts that I'm thinking right now are probably having like a biological impact on my brain, but then vice versa. So it's like chicken and the egg. It's like, what comes first? Like, is it physical? Is it mental? What are some of the mental causes of anxiety? Can you mentally bring yourself to an anxious state? I guess the answer is yes.
I love it. Yeah. So first of all, bidirectional causation, right? So the mind and brain are flip sides of a single underlying reality. And so the mind, how about this? Anything that changes our perception of the level of danger and threat that we face, that's a mental perception, right? That's an interpretation of our experience, maybe by changing our attention or how we interpret things. That can have ripple effects that are experienced at a biological, physical hardware level, right? So change the mind, change the body, but also change the body, change the mind. What I will tell you is that both causal pathways are hugely important for us in everyday life as well as in clinical settings. Psychotherapists usually focus on a top-down, what I mean by top-down, change the mind, then change the brain, change the body. Therapists will focus on how can we change your perception to affect a change in your brain and your body. And then physicians will usually focus on the bottom-up approach. How can we change your body?
So literally, I'm standing up right now. Bottom up is like my body moving up to my mind. So
Yes.
My body changing my mind, and then top down would be my mind impacting my body.
Exactly
It's
right.
very logical when you lay it out like that, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, but remember, this is the world that I've been living in for the last 32 years. I mean, we have to, those of us in the business need to have these kind of mental tools. We call them heuristics, right? Mental shortcuts. And I think this heuristic of understanding, look, anxiety is both physical and mental. They're both intertwined. And you can affect it either through changing the mind or through changing the body. Now, having said that, what I do want to say is that there are certain cases where the anxiety is so obviously being driven by the body that it is really not efficient to try to influence it by changing the mind. So, for example, I have worked with patients and I've known students who have gone on hormonal birth control that, basically what it did apparently was drop their progesterone levels cyclically throughout the month. And when their levels were low, they were missing that super powerful anti-anxiety hormone. And they responded with this visceral, debilitating level of anxiety that was completely out of the blue, out of character. There was nothing stressful going on. And it would have been ridiculous to try to do cognitive therapy on them to talk them out of their anxiety. A, it probably wouldn't even work. And B, it's so inefficient. By the way, C, almost every person that I've known in that situation was put on anti-anxiety meds, which turns out to be exactly the wrong approach, right? Because now we're just papering over one biological driver of anxiety with another biological Band-Aid that's not really addressing the underlying problem at all. And so again, really inefficient.
That's crazy. And it actually, again, I hate bringing everything back to depression, but hey, we all do it with our own experiences. Like one of the big kind of penny drop moments for me was that, hey, your depression is probably 90% physical. And that's where like your work and your book, The Depression Cure especially, that came in clutch at a very important time in my life. But I'd spent like most of my life focusing on the mind side of stuff. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I need more therapy, or I need to create these like psychological like ninja tactics to like overcome this and overcome that. And it's definitely trauma, and I need to go on and actually it was just like, dude, like not to like give any spoilers. It was like, you got to clean up your diet. You got to do a lot of exercise. You got to really make sleep a priority. You got to do all these other physical things, many of which we'll talk about later on. And that was very, very liberating for me. So I appreciate you kind of making that connection.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's not to short shrift the mental side of things. Absolutely. Because when people are, and for some of us, that's really where we need to focus. And I will tell you in my own journey, both have been important. Changing my body, changing my brain from the bottom up, that's been super important. But changing my mind from the top down. Learning how not to ruminate and brood. Learning how not to worry about not having control. Not being able to predict exactly what's going to happen. It turns out that when we don't have a feeling of control, there have been some really elegant experiments with lab rats, and they're kind of cruel, so I'm not even going to describe them in detail, but you can imagine rats that are given different kinds of very painful tail shocks. They have a lot of nerve endings in their tails. And if they just can predict and know when it's coming, they get so much less anxious than if it comes out of the blue. So if the bad thing is going to come, but we know and we understand okay, yeah, that's the bad thing. And I know when it's going to happen, and I know what it's all about, and I can predict it perfectly, and I can brace myself. It's like that sucks, but that does not make us pathologically anxious most of the time. So lack of control, lack of predictability, lack of certainty, those are all things that we can work on making our peace with. And we could talk about that maybe a little bit more in part 2 of our episode. But I just want to say, how about this? There are forms of anxiety that we will be most efficient in addressing by changing the mind. There are forms of anxiety that we will be most efficient addressing by changing the body. In my clinical experience, that last group is larger. But that does not mean, by the way, all those people that are have their anxiety driven in part by their bodies, it doesn't mean that they need to be on drugs. Because as you've discovered, Hugh, in your own journey, there are so many ways of changing the brain, changing the body that do not involve meds. And that can be, I feel like that's sort of my unique little lane in the mental health space is as somebody who's trained as a clinical neuroscientist. So like I really, really appreciate deeply the impact of the brain and the body. And yet I also am completely obsessed with the thousands of different ways that our lifestyle, how we live, the things we do to our body, what we eat, how we move, the kind of bright light we get, the kind of microbes that are inhabiting our body, how those things affect the brain. And it's so empowering.
Absolutely. I'm going to jump the gun here. I know we were going to cover this in part 2, but I actually think it would be lovely just to put it in here at the end of part 1. Like, because it is your life's work. Whenever I talk to other people about you, I describe your life's work as exactly what you've laid out, where it's you're not against medication, you're not against drugs, but you are very, very passionate and very interested about how your lifestyle and everything that entails kind of comes together to creating the whole and healed version of yourself, I suppose. Yeah. So talk to me about polytherapy, because it's not something that I'd ever heard of until you wrote it in this bullet point.
In the mental health space, I think that both providers, so clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, and patients are all singing from the same hymn book. They're all on the same page, which is like, we are all looking for the magic bullet. It's like, okay, if we can just figure out, so you're having clinical anxiety, if we can just figure out exactly what the problem is, like maybe you're not, being mindful enough, maybe you're ruminating too much, maybe you have some sort of hormonal imbalance. The big one, of course, that we always hear about is you have a, quote, chemical imbalance, unquote, in the brain, right? That's a really good phrase for selling drugs, it turns out. Right? Drug companies love that.
Yeah, that might have been invented by a copywriter rather than a neuroscientist.
I'm thinking, we'll gloss over that point. But yeah, almost certainly that's true. So we're always looking for the magic bullet, the golden intervention, the single thing that's going to cure this problem. And the hard truth is that for most forms of psychological suffering, they are so complex, they hit us at so many different levels, that for most people, there is no magic bullet. Now, in the business, the search for the magic bullet, we call that monotherapy, which is just a fancy way of saying using one drug, using one mode of intervention, whether it's psychotherapy or therapeutic light box or whatever the thing is. Monotherapy, we got the magic bullet. Polytherapy is just the opposite of that. It's saying, hey, let's do all the things because this is too hard to fix with one thing. And if we just rely on the one thing, we're probably never going to find it. Which means what? We're going to get maybe some relief, a little bit of reduction of suffering, but it might be like 30% relief or 50% relief for a while, but not for a lifetime. And if we want to have full and lasting healing, we almost always need to do nearly all the things. And what does that mean? We need to change how we think. We need to change how we live. We need to tackle the problem as if it is a matter of, and this is going to sound dramatic, but a matter of life and death. Because if we want to live our best life, we need to be free from that kind of suffering. And if we really want to be free, we can't just rely, for now at least, on the magic bullet. And that sounds like a big indictment of the meds. And yes, it is. I'm not anti-medication. I'm truly grateful for the millions of lives that have been made better. Occasionally, we'll have somebody who is completely cured by the pill of their pathological anxiety, and they can live their best possible life just by taking the pill. But that is not the majority. It's not even close to the majority. And by the way, we could say exactly the same thing about CBT, the most scientifically investigated, validated form of psychotherapy, the kind of therapy that I was trained in, cognitive behavioral therapy. It has a short-term response rate of about 50% across anxiety disorders. I mean, that's good, but it's not 100%. And even those 50% are not typically fully cured. So we need to do all the things, or at least some approximation of it. That's polytherapy.
Incredible stuff. Hello, this is Hugh from the future here in the editing room, and I think this is probably just as good as any place to wrap up for today. As you've probably guessed from the title of this episode, we will be releasing part 2 next week on Monday morning, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell on your favourite podcast app, as the cool kids like to say, so you don't miss out on all the good stuff, mainly Steve, but also sometimes myself, have to say. As always, you can expect plenty of practical tools and practices to come. But until then, I just really want to say thank you so much for being here. We'd really appreciate you sharing this podcast with the people you care about the most, or dropping us a wee note to say hello by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Honest feedback is welcome. We make this show for you. We want to make this show better. And so any way you can help us do that, we would be all ears to hear from you and make that happen. Would also like to mention that this is a crowdfunded show, which means that we rely on the generosity of listeners just like you who want to join us on our journey and our mission of providing free educational content around the theme of mental health for people all over the world without having to sell our souls or compromise our content to the gods of advertising or sponsorship. So look, if the podcast has benefited you in any sort of way and you have the means to pledge the price of a, hipster cup of coffee each month, I'd love to invite you to our private community over at patreon.com/mental health podcast, where you can also get access to exclusive content, early releases of episodes, including the full version of today's episode. Right now, it's sitting over there on the Patreon, and also the chance to connect with us and each other in a more intimate way. There's also our website, mentalhealth.fm, which is where you can submit a question for our upcoming Q&A episode, as well as checking out the show notes for links to everything we covered in this week's episode. Thanks so much again for being here, and as the good professor often says, peace out and stay well until next time. Cheers.